Thank you so much for coming to this panel. It's going to be incredible. I've spoken to all four of them, and I'm really excited about having them share all of their great knowledge with you. If you did see my presentation earlier, you already saw this one. If you didn't, then great, this will be the first time. But we'll start. I think I need the clicker. Hopefully the clicker works this time. There we go. So we're on the road. If you don't know what I'm talking about this morning, there was a little blip with my slides, and so now they're working perfectly, which is great. So before we get started with the panel, I want to just contextualize the VR industry for everyone and give you a sense of where we are, where we're going, and then we'll talk on the panel about the why and what their expectations are from the ground level. So this is a graph just solely about consumer software and hardware revenue, but why it's important is because of that sort of gap of disappointment or that slow lead that we're seeing. And the reason why I wanted to bring that up is because this is what a lot of people base their belief in VR on, or AR, MR. But as we all know, and you're here because you understand that that's not necessarily the case. This is not necessarily where we're going to see the most growth and the most interest. So, looking at investments, we're seeing a little bit of a dip. But why we see that dip in terms of external investment has a lot to do with the kind of internal R&D that we've been seeing more and more. And companies that are working firsthand with VR for their own enterprise solutions, as well as companies that are extending their services out, are able to kind of fund that with R&D costs in a way, or fund that with R&D funds in a way that consumer software just isn't necessarily able to do. So you see a lot of these development studios that are able to provide both consumer and enterprise experiences based on the learnings that they have from consumer experiences, but are unable to monetize those. So in the near future, this is why we're going to see a lot of R&D growth, and a lot, in terms of the scale of R&D versus external funding, it's much larger on the R&D side when you're looking at enterprise. And what this means is not necessarily that there isn't investment on the part of the software providers or content providers. It's just that there is a more easily monetizable market when we're looking at enterprise as opposed to consumer. So many, many more companies are looking to VR, AR, and MR for solutions, for challenges that they have yet to be able to really understand or solve, or even things that they've already been able to solve but want to do better. And when VRX put out a survey that I'm sure a lot of you responded to, and based on their survey, they found that of the attendees, the real focus that we're seeing is in training and simulation. Now, up here, we're going to talk a lot about different use cases, but training and simulation can really fall into a lot of different things. So we see education coming out of there as well. And we see a lot of ways that this kind of technology and this category is going to really change how we view VR. And really, you could consider training as part of marketing and sales, right? There are a lot of overlaps here. But it really shows that there are specific interests on the part of the industry that are very strong, and that there is overlap, and it is an interest specifically in training and simulation. And finally, when we look at supply and demand, we find that amongst the content developers, this is the percentage of which, the share of which content developers are creating content or have interest in different categories. And then on the demand side, it's the share of those companies looking for VR solutions that are interested in these different categories. We find that education and healthcare are just hugely important right now to the industry. Again, something that I think we'll talk a lot about on this panel. Whereas you see, architecture design, which seems very straightforward and certainly is important, you do find that a lot of content creators are creating for this, and it's going to come down to just a few who can do this really well, as opposed to some of the other markets where there are very specific pieces and challenges and solutions that will need to be overcome, such as education and healthcare that have a lot of variation. under them. So without further ado, giving some of this as context, I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, starting with Walter.
Hi, everybody. I'm excited to be here. I'm a behavioral neuroscientist, research scientist by training, working at Stanford University, but I've also had the opportunity to work in the field of medical VR for almost 30 years now. This is an exciting time for me, as you can imagine, to see things take off. I have one foot in the academic arena doing some basic neuroscience research, but I'm working with a number of medical VR startups, and including one unicorn that has raised more than 100 million at a greater than $1 billion valuation. So things are moving really fast in the medical arena, and I'm glad to be here to talk to you about it.
Cool. Frank Soqui, General Manager for Virtual Reality. I think we did our speed dating session earlier, so I think you know me.
Hey everybody, I'm John Buzzell, and we have an immersive technology lab as part of an agency group headquartered in Atlanta. We serve clients across a number of different industries and sectors, AT&T, Porsche, utility companies like Southern Company. We're agnostic as to device or platform or even medium, and we help people connect physical and digital worlds together for greater awareness and engagement. We started off doing a lot of brand marketing because those are the fast first movers, and increasingly we're seeing more interest in the enterprise sector. So I'm excited to be part of the panel.
My name is Marc. I run the enterprise business for Epic Games. And you had a glimpse of what I do in the previous presentations.
Fantastic. So I want to start off with a sort of generalized question. I mean, you saw the results of our research, but from your point of view, where in enterprise are you seeing a lot of that momentum and growth and interest? We'll start, Walter.
Well, because of my focus in medical applications VR, I'm seeing a lot of interest there. And it's really a huge pent-up demand, as you described, Stephanie. The large medical device companies, the large pharmaceutical companies, all are looking how they can use and leverage AR and VR to go beyond the pill, is the expression they use in pharma, and go beyond the device, is what they say in medical device, to connect with their users, collect data from those users, and build out their enterprise. And also, VR can be a telemedicine platform, so it's going to allow these pharmaceutical companies and medical device companies and also the enterprise of care providing to reach out to underserved areas. So everybody's very excited, and there's a huge pent-up demand.
Right. Well, I guess to go off of that, you have a very specific perspective, and I think a lot of you have specific but also generalized perspectives based on who you've worked with and projects that you've done. So can you guys talk about maybe one of the, a use case that you've seen that's not necessarily something that people would think is a solution that VR would satisfy?
Well, that's hard to pick because I think what I was trying to press on you earlier is it feels like there's a natural extension for what people want to do today, what businesses or people want to do today, to have it become more immersive. So I'm not sure that anything's really out of bounds yet, especially this early in adoption. I like the experimentation and things that have been going on there. I think that what might surprise you might have been the medical one I gave you, which is, why would a doctor be in VR? Because people think of VR as a gaming thing, or it's, is it really going to improve patient care and patient connection? Aren't surgeons already smart? Don't they know how to do surgery? Aren't all the tools already there? And I think it was a little surprising to hear doctors go, wow, I can actually remove 100% of the tumor. Wasn't able to do that before. With a simple visualization technique, really? So that one surprised me. But when you look back on it, it's like, okay, yeah, now it makes sense. Anything that surprises you makes sense when you hear about the business value and the result that it attained.
I'd like to add to that. We've been pleasantly surprised, and it's nice to see some of the research validate this. The interest, we've had such a love affair with technology and feature and capability for the last few years, right? I mean, how many people had the DK2, and we're so excited when these different consumer versions of these hardware hit the market. But increasingly, we're starting to see more interest in the kind of banal corners. We have a client in the heating and refrigeration space, and they are so thrilled to not have to spend $25 million on training centers across the country. Now they can, rent inexpensive real estate. They can put a few room scale devices in there, and for these installers or contractors that may have a 5th grade education, and can't manipulate wands or touch controllers, to be able to slap a leap motion onto the front of that and have them manipulate parts and go through some simulations and have trainers watch a distributed training session across different centers. That's super exciting, but that's not a corner that we would have been looking in a year ago. So I think this is really starting to increase quality, improve access, and consistency, and that speaks to the kind of the maturation or the sophistication of the discussion.
Absolutely. That makes me wonder then, with a lot of these people that are just, getting into VR on the enterprise side that have never thought about using VR, does that mean that enterprise is going to help consumer adoption?
I think and I'm going to probably mangle this guy's last name because I've never met him in person, but Matt Miesniks has this brilliant, one of many very brilliant posts on Medium where he talks about the constellation of devices that are going to help propel us into kind of a waveguide-enabled mixed reality future, and he just talks about how the enterprise will go first because people are paid to do these things, to put a device on your face that you wouldn't be caught dead in public using. I do think that that's where it'll go, and I think our clients are starting to see that opportunity.
I tend to think of it, when you ask the enterprise question, I think my mind goes immediately like B2C type things. So the B part would be the enterprise piece, but the connection to the consumer piece, I think, is the angle to go reach more consumers. And I'm sort of becoming a bigger fan of location-based X, location-based anything, because you're touching a consumer in ways you hadn't touched them before to influence them, and they're becoming more aware of what VR can do because of that B2C touch. And I think that's how it's going to change it. But I think we partly ignored the reverse of that, where these consumer technologies are already impacting enterprise. I think it's this sort of almost like a cycle that goes on here, where each one kind of reinforces the other.
In medicine, there are things that problems we cannot solve without AR and VR technology. There are diseases we have very few tools to address that VR enables. So for us, it's being able to really change the dynamic and make a big difference immediately. So that's what's going to drive adoption in that arena.
Absolutely. Marc, so if we can switch over to you. I mean, from your end as an engine, you've kind of evolved from gaming to having this more generalized ability to influence media like VR. So what are some of the challenges that Unreal has been able to resolve on the enterprise level specifically?
So the opportunity for us, what we're seeing is, and we're being dragged into more than anything, is everywhere there is a computer graphics workflow, people want it to be more efficient, and people want the content to be interactive because VR is the right way to consume interactive content because you can really get into, the understanding of complex mechanisms. You can make a lot of sophisticated decisions. You can create a lot of emotions as well. So across the board, it's hard to pick one place when we're seeing faster, but CG workflows are migrating to interactivity at warp speed. I mean, this is, we saw it in the architectural space and everything. There's a little bit of the compromise on the visual quality. We do not have the quality of the renders, of the offline renders, but people are willing to sacrifice that because of the benefit of being interactive and immersive. And we saw it last year with the NASA. You build muscle memory now in VR. It goes beyond the pretty picture. Or you will hear from Patrick at BMW and all the work they do in their hybrid reality lab. Or it's really fascinating, how that tool to help you make better decisions is actually having a wide impact in the enterprise in terms of just efficiency. And who wants to wait for a render farm anymore? I mean, people do not accept that.
Right, absolutely.
One follow-up to that. You all probably know that Google announced with Poly, their 3D asset store, that they have an API into Unity, and I'm sure there'll be many more platforms to follow. That's really an important thing. It was kind of, didn't get the most press, but back in the early days of the web, when you got CSS and you could separate your content from presentation, when you could start focusing on the semantic aspect of the content, apart from having to code it into a specific layout, that's going to help to democratize the process. Right now with Unreal and Unity, the production pathway is pretty arcane. It's hard to get people that haven't previously had a game development background into some of these tools, and we know because we're trying to scale up as fast as we can. tools like Sansar, Sumerian, I'm sure you know the editor, the XR editor from Unity and products from Unreal. That's going to be really important. So we should all be watching for that because that's the moment when we can start to scale beyond individual studios and get at those big R&D bar charts that are in that slide that we were just looking at. It's nice to see that developing, but it's hard to be patient.
Yeah, getting the data into VR remains the main problem. And that's the problem we're tackling, you know, at front. And it has to be part of the business processes to generate the real-time assets. We work with our customers right now implementing this concept of permanent parallel pipelines, where every time you do something in the real, which is in the CAD, you know, some sort of automatically you can generate the real-time assets so that every time through the life cycle of the product, you can actually pick it up in VR to support a workflow like a tolerance analysis, a collaborative review, or a marketing asset. And until we've actually eliminated the cost of data prep and, you know, bring down the cost of generating the real-time asset to zero, I think adoption will be a problem. So I agree with you that Poly is a great authoring tool for consumer level, and it's going to make a big difference as well. So we have to work in the enterprise on the pipeline, or what we call a pipeline, and at the level of the tools like Poly in the consumer space.
So I have a question for you on the tool side. You said collaborations. Does that mean Unity's focusing on, because you said interactivity. I would have assumed interactivity with an environment versus collaboration or the social aspects. Are you including those in your?
Yeah, it's the same. Yep. So, you know, it's part of the same technology stack for us.
Cool.
Absolutely.
Well, what's the technology that hasn't developed yet that needs to come into play before we can really see the results that you're, you know, that the folks you're working with want to see?
A very biased point of view, I mean, the pipeline and the data transformation pipeline, I mean, we have to get rid of the cost of transforming assets for real time. Full point, end of story. I mean, that's the single biggest obstacle to the adoption of that content.
And I think that's where Poly really, if it has a weak point, that's it, is that for the enterprise, you can't get there with, maybe you can in some contexts, but you can't get there with common objects, right? You know, we have a large transit client, and they have very specific geometries that won't be found in any asset store. So the need to ingest that entire domain, to do it well, so that if you train somebody, I mean, it is actually life and death if you can't make one of these buses or trains work, right? That's going to require a lot more and better technologies than we have now.
Well, for the big thing, in my opinion, is shared virtual environments. It's multi-user virtual environments. We can't have enterprise action without having people be able to share and be in the same space dynamically with each other. And that technology really needs to grow fast. Also, getting emotions into virtual environments, being able to get facial expressions and the correct body language and heuristics about movement. People seem like robots when they're in a virtual environment now. So there are some enabling things that have been developed in the flat screen arena, in the gaming arena, but haven't yet made it into our VR worlds. And we really need to have that in order to have the veracity and interpersonal communication that's part of working together as a team.
We had an interesting discussion about previous learnings from other waves of VR and VR development. So I'd like you to kind of talk about that. You know, what are the things that the industry learned previously that maybe the industry currently doesn't realize there are solutions for?
Well, what always surprises me is that we've had university-based research on how to address simulator sickness, how to move around in a virtual world, how to share information in a virtual world. All these basic paradigms and heuristics have been worked out over decades in the university-based labs and are published on, you know, in PubMed and other journals. And when I meet many of the developers now who, you know, often migrate from other areas like the gaming industry or from special effects industry, they have no idea that some of these problems that they're spending a lot of time, a lot of money solving were solved a few, or sometimes a decade ago. And it's almost like the lost knowledge is out there to be found, but nobody's looking for it.
Yeah, I thought that was particularly interesting, especially we talked a little bit about motion sickness and ways that previous generations of VR has kind of overcome those things. So currently, you know, I wonder from your experiences, you know, what are those kinds of tech challenges that really inhibit the ability to find the solutions you're looking for?
I would think workflow is a kind of a way of thinking about a tech solution. these data sets are gigantic. We're experiencing that with some of the sports, the VR sports work that we're doing. But getting that workflow from a cloud to edge and having it be interactive and reduce latency, and then you include collaboration and all the other things people want to share and do and interact with, I don't think those workflows are well understood. And as much as we've advanced what's going on with cloud architectures and software-defined networks, I don't think we've comprehended the nature of this highly interactive, immersive workload on that type of environment. And that's what I think we need to figure out what that looks like, and then have some sort of basis for saying, here's a baseline of what that looks like that you can build and differentiate on top of. But I don't see an easy answer for that one right now.
I think on the resources side, looking at CD-ROM and looking at web after it, skills are going to come before intuition, right? We're going to see, as we did in the web with print designers getting jobs as web designers and designing a lot of pretty crummy websites for 6 years, and with a lot of CD-ROMs that were books or videos in the beginning, so too will go, this isn't XRX, this is BRX, but so too will go immersive, right? That will get a lot of people, as the demand has really been held up as people have been focusing so much on consumer adoption. So not enough people have gone into these programs that might be available through VR First or through a local university. So it's going to be difficult, and we're going to get a lot of bad labor, I think, over the next 5 to 8 years. And I think tools will help a tremendous amount. But experience is what's going to help us from having, VR or immersive experience that look a lot like mobile apps.
Yeah, I agree. Access to talent, and we have to develop new languages, new forms, is the single biggest problem that we face in terms of advancing this forward. And keep on telling people, send your kids to game design school because this is how they're going to change the world.
Right.
This is,
Yeah.
if you want to change the
If
world.
I could redo
learn
my
game
career
engineering.
again, I would do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I find that VR kind of, there's this interesting dynamic we're seeing right now where companies have problems that they're not sure how to solve, and potentially VR is the right way to do that, so they're putting a lot of R&D into that. And then you have companies that can potentially build tools to overcome those problems, but don't know exactly what they are so that they can build them, right? So the developers are not necessarily sure. It's kind of like a dating game. Like you're not sure who's going to be your best match. So how do developers, let's start with developers, how do developers find those pain points that they can address?
I mean, I was listening to a gentleman from the investment community this morning saying, they haven't seen people leave companies to create companies because it's the benefits of VR interactive content is so entrenched. It's an efficiency benefit. It's essential to improve time to market, to respond to the market pressure. And VR makes just a lot of process faster and more efficient. So it is a productivity play. It's not something it's hard you can do from the outside. We're seeing this adoption, and we need talent so that help those enterprises. We need more talent actually than luminary external founders. They need to get those millennial kids in the pipeline and start to understand how we create those environments. There's a lot that the game industry and the film industry need to teach to the enterprise on how to manage content, digital content at scale. There's this big gap between the PDM and the CMS, between the product development and marketing. We need to bridge that gap. It's all process, it's all efficiency. I don't think it's a magical technology. And it's the many, many uses and the many, many devices will bring to bear to kind of consume that content to make things more efficient. And there is even a world where the content itself, virtual goods will become integral part of the product. Maybe you'll buy a skin for the interface into your car one day. So it's so entrenched into the backbone of the enterprise that, I don't expect to see a quantum leap in adoption. We have great technology. Moore's Law is helping us. We need to get the talent, and we need to get the enterprises to realize that, interactive content, that content is critical to my productivity moving forward. And those assets are extremely valuable. Those real-time assets, they should be cherished. We see it in the car industries where same assets, we do a lot of HMI projects right now because those the way you interface with the car, the technique and the visual language of video games is actually a good way to interact with a sophisticated machinery that a car has become. But that content you'll see inside your car and you'll see on the thread, it has to be the same model because we don't have time to reinvent that content all the time. It's just way too expensive. So it's really a content-driven world from my perspective. And you know, it's about, I think we have most of the tech that we need. Granted, you know, can have better form factors for headset, and we will get them. But it's all about processes and workflows.
This is a really critical time for our industry. We're in a state now, with all due respect to the OEMs, where the hardware releases are starting to seem more and more incremental. I'm excited to get our Pimax Kickstarter so we can have 8K, but then we're starting to run up against, you know, well, can you feed that? And there's the Vario announcement, and they have to partner with the GPU manufacturer to be able to. Anyway, we're going to have to gut it out for the next few years and find those use cases agnostic to medium. You know, we started a project with Porsche with their innovations group, and we started with HoloLens, and Frank, you'll love this. They were trying to take the dealership experience to their customers, because they'll gladly sell you a 911 for $130K, but they'd much rather work with their exclusives group to kit it out with a bunch of high margin extras that, you know, that make the customer happier and make the client or the business happier. But the challenge that they ran into is for all the features of the HoloLens, they didn't feel like it looked like a Porsche. They felt like it, you know, had some interesting novel interactions for their sales interaction, but they needed, you know, thank God ARKit came in and they could try something at scale. But if we had just been a one-tech shop or a one-device shop, then we would have been limited in our ability to help them get to the next step. And for now they've pulled together a whole working group across the whole globe around augmented reality. But it's going to take some of these frustrating stops and starts across different devices and mediums to get people to understand the opportunity.
It's interesting. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, in medicine, we don't like to use the term killer app, but but if you recall back when the personal computer revolution started, it was spreadsheets and word processing, which was across the enterprise. It's not for the enterprise, it was across all enterprises. And I think that's what's going to help propel this industry to take off.
Yeah, when I think about VR adoption that comes from enterprise, a lot of that I feel like is sort of the XL effect, where people are going to have to use VR in their business environment and find that there's a lot of interesting things they can do with it at home. But talking about devices and talking about challenges with different devices, can you guys kind of talk about your experiences with the different? I think a big problem that some folks in the industry have is which device is for me and which device is the one that I should use for this problem. We found Vive was really quick to jump on with enterprise solutions. Rift has come in and tried to do that as well. So, what are some insights you can give on how you choose a device and, if you go across devices?
From an enterprise side, it should always start with what problem are you trying to solve?
Yes.
When you have a hammer, everything's a nail. Mm-hmm. My hammer solves everything. Well, okay, and I was going to go back to the developer side on that as well. You have to figure out what the problems are. Your customers are going to describe many problems that you can't solve. Focus on their highest priority problems, and then ask yourself honestly, does this solution fit the problem? Because you may have to change your solution to fit their problem. Not use the hammer you have, but develop a new hammer to fit the nail that they have. I think we rush to, here's what I have, you should use it, versus figure out what the real problem statement is. And then that's how you end up picking. Otherwise, all paths will get you there, right? One choice is as good as another. I don't know why we don't focus on the problem statement. It's what we do at home naturally, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't need a headset to immerse, right? You can do it with audio, you can do it with projection, you can do it with video walls, you can do it with haptics at large scale or personal intimate scale. We used to spend a lot of time in the experiential marketing space. And you can't have people queue for 40 minutes for a 4-minute experience. They'll take it off, they'll say that was cool, and then they're on to the next thing. So if you can find ways to think of audience and learning curve, if you can think of the total round-trip experience from the time you get someone in a training center or to a dealership to the time you get them on to the next phase of the customer cycle, that's really important, and a headset doesn't always fit that.
Yeah, what that means to me is that not only do you focus on the problem statement, but then how do you measure you solve the problem? Mm-hmm. And I oversimplified, I said TCO and ROI, but that's a proxy for, and then how do you measure you actually solve the problem? Right. You had the return or the benefit that you said you were going after. Yeah. Just some basic disciplines got to go into, versus this mad rush as this technology fits everything.
That's interesting, yeah. Well, I want to make sure that you and that your questions are addressed. So does anybody have questions for our panelists up here? I know they're out there, so raise your hand. Don't be shy.
We're not shy.
No,
Oh, your
certainly not.
hand went
Okay,
up.
great. We have someone kicking it off here.
Carlos Velasquez, Air Studio. I'm curious, I've been in the content development, it feels like one of the biggest criteria is creating connection and presence. Can any of you speak to how to accomplish that in your experience?
Well, actually, there's been a lot of research on that. And so I encourage you to take a look at some of the published literature about how we measure presence and how we generate presence. And it really, it depends on the application. Interactivity is really important. Comfort's really important. Not so much visual veracity, surprisingly. But again, it depends on your use case. But there are some publications and research studies on how to increase the feeling of immersion and how to measure it.
I was going to add a little bit to that because I'm not a professor. I don't have any research along those lines. But think of presence the way you think of presence right now. It's audio, it's video, call it haptics, but I'm feeling things when I'm sitting down. Anytime you want people to feel like they're present, make sure that there's a connection. I'll oversimplify. Just the fact that when I'm talking to you that you're looking back to me is a sense of presence. When people create these avatars or versions of their friends and they're active in that, if their eyes aren't looking at you, you've lost the sense of presence. People intuitively know what it is. So I think it's going to take some experimentation plus relying on academia that's actually clearly calling out what it takes to create presence.
Would you say leaning on senses?
On senses?
Senses. Human senses.
So the more you engage, and again, my personal opinion is the more you engage a little bit of every sense, the more present you feel. Mm-hmm. I think most of you have seen this goofy YouTube video where there's guy's got the VR headset, he's crawling along the ground, there's little holes he's supposed to just look into. He tries to put his head into the hole. And he only tricked his eyes, right? Imagine if you tricked his eyes and there's a little bit of haptics and audio, and all of a sudden, I'm ashamed to admit it, but I was in an environment and there was a table there, and for some reason I thought I could, I don't know what was in my head when I did that, but the 360 audio and a little bit of haptics and the visual experience already tricked me. And we're gonna have to be careful with that because when we're talking about training people, you can't create more hazards than the ones you're trying to simulate for them.
Our brains are a highly adaptable piece of equipment. It wants to believe. And so I don't think you have to have high fidelity in any one sense for you to achieve that sense of presence or suspension of disbelief. If you can maintain a horizon, if you have some semblance of earthly physics, if you have scarcity, like attention, eye contact, that kind of thing, that keeps your brain focused on the experience and away from some of the technical hurdles or what have you. Helen Papagiannis has a really nice book called The Augmented Human that rounds up all of the different sensory kind of advancements in VR, everything from touch to taste and in between. And so, I would say start bare minimum. I mean, if you look at that Leap Motion Blocks demo, it's amazing how long people will spend in there, and all you have is a horizon and flat shaded objects.
Yeah,
but you can see your fingers, and they move very quickly, so it's enough.
We're visual animals, but we're also social animals. And having interactivity with other people in some form really creates a better feeling
this?
of being. Yes, exactly. or eye contact, as you mentioned. It's there, and that's something that I think we're lacking in a lot of our interactions now, is we don't have multi-user environments stood up very well yet in virtual environments.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, and you were talking earlier about emotion, being able to visualize other people's emotions.
We're emotional animals too.
Yeah. All right, well,
That is a.
Sorry.
So I agree with what you say about, you don't need much to create presence, but we did a lot of work on interactive digital human. We did at SIGGRAPH, we had a virtual Maximor, but that is going to be so much more work to be able to cross the uncanny valley and to read emotion expression. We're so trained to read faces, and that is a space where we see still a lot of work to actually create presence with another human and doing eye contact and having the proper facial expression. It's have a lot of work ahead of us there. That's much more difficult to achieve than anything else.
Well, we have time for one more quick question. which is right there.
Okay, Nicole Lazaro, president of Zeozyne. I'm on a panel tomorrow on increasing immersion through audio and haptics. And I was curious, I definitely agree in terms of fidelity is not our, that you don't, that a good experience doesn't require, a high fidelity input on any of the senses that we use. But I do have a question for the panel, and in terms of like how much value is presence and immersion in these experiences? It takes a lot to create them. If all we're getting as users is presence or immersion, that's, I might as well do the real thing, hazards aside, right? And so I was curious, do any of you sort of craft, what thought have you done in terms of crafting the user emotion to create the proper emotional response to the task at hand? For example, at this point in this operation, we should be feeling this way because that enhances these cognitive abilities. I have to be creative, or I have to problem solve. You've got this arc that goes through. I was curious if we're really getting into, the emotions, not just mimicking them, puppeting them, but actually making people feel with a enterprise outcome.
All right, let's do our elevator pitch. We have just 1 more minute, so go.
I want to say like, what? It depends on what you're trying to accomplish with that particular point of immersion. Some points are immersion about a peer experience. Some points of immersion are about getting me to buy something. So it's hard for me to just blanket typify how and when you would go do that. What I would say is the models you would use use the same models you use during human interaction. When you're going to go buy a car, when you're going to go learn something, when you're going to go skydiving, pick your points of immersion that were more impactful to you as you want to go learn and experience that, and then apply it to that environment. Because you're right, you're trying to recreate reality, so why not use reality as a model? That'd be my oversimplistic way.
And I would add, I agree completely, and I would add that people are different. What immerses some people will not immerse other people. Yeah. So we have to study our users, quickly determine what is most compelling for them, and have adaptive systems to pay attention to that. Because some people are more visual, some people are more auditory, some people are more social, and it depends on what you're trying to accomplish too. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Thank you guys so much. If you have more questions, the panelists will be around. Let's give them a round of applause.
Hey, thanks.